Night had just fallen over the wild northern mountains of Alaska. Snow fell thickly, and wind whistled through the wooden seams of the solitary cabin at the end of the trail. Matthew, a man who had lived alone for nearly 2 decades, sat beside the fireplace with a cup of hot tea and an old book he had read countless times. Outside was an unforgiving frozen world, where every blizzard could wipe away all traces of life. But tonight, amid the sub-zero cold and the howling wind that sounded like morning, another sound, stranger, weaker, cut through the stillness like a thick blanket of snow. A light scratching, then again, then a trembling whimper. Matthew leaned forward from his chair, heart pounding with unease. He thought of stray dogs, maybe even an off-season bear. But when he looked through the frost-covered windowpane, he froze. On his porch were 2 wolves. No growling, no aggression. They hadn't come to hunt. One of them was trembling, its front leg limping. Both were covered in snow, and their eyes held not a threatening gleam, but a plea. Matthew hesitated. His instincts told him that wild creatures never kneel before humans. But what he saw now was no longer instinct. It was desperation, a fragility between life and death. Never in all his freezing winters had Matthew faced such a harsh choice. Open the door, or let these beings vanish into the darkness forever. He took a deep breath, gripping the flashlight tightly in his palm. And then, he opened the door, slowly, without a word. On the other side of the door, the 2 wild creatures didn't lunge forward. They just stood there, shivering, looking at him, as if waiting for a miracle born from compassion. A strange story had begun. Not with thunder, but with the silence of mercy. Cold wind lashed Matthew's face as the wooden door swung open. Snow spiraled across the porch, and the 2 wolves still stood there. One larger, its body stretched forward to shield the smaller one limping behind. Their eyes locked onto him, not with hostility, but with something deeply human, a plea. Matthew's heart grew heavy. His survival instincts, honed over years, screamed, "Don't." But another voice, quiet, persistent, whispered. They came with trust. "Don't betray that." He slowly stepped back a few paces, leaving the door open. No barking, no violent leaps, just one step, then another. The larger wolf entered first, cautious, eyes never leaving Matthew. The smaller one limped in after, leaving a faint trail of blood on the cold wooden floor. Once both creatures stood inside the warm wooden cabin, Matthew shut the door. The howling wind outside was cut off. And inside, there remained only the heavy breathing of 2 survivors. And the man facing something no one had ever taught him how to handle. Trust from a wild species. He kept his distance, hand resting near a walking stick beside the fireplace. But his eyes couldn't hide the emotion rising within him. The larger wolf didn't growl. It simply stood between Matthew and its companion, like a warrior guarding a fragile trust. Matthew poured a bowl of water, and set down the last piece of smoked meat from his dinner, placing it far from where he stood. They didn't lunge. They approached slowly, politely, like guests who knew how to be grateful. The smaller wolf ate with difficulty, but its eyes softened. The larger one didn't eat right away. It waited until it was certain its companion was safe. As the firelight began to flicker against their snow-drenched fur, Matthew realized he had crossed a threshold, not between man and beast, but between defense and welcome, between fear and compassion. And in that moment, his tiny cabin, once merely a place to escape the cold, became a crossroads for souls that were never meant to meet. As warmth gradually spread through the cabin and golden firelight cast flickering shadows across the wooden floor, Matthew sat in his old wooden chair, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. His eyes didn't stray from the 2 wolves curled up in the corner of the room. The smaller one whimpered softly as it shifted position, its hind leg roughly bandaged with a torn piece of cloth Matthew had found. The larger wolf didn't sleep, it kept watch. Its posture was taut like a drawn bow, amber eyes reflecting the firelight, always flicking toward Matthew with every slight movement he made. Matthew sighed and turned toward the window. Outside, the wind still howled in gusts through the pine trees, heavy with snow and ice. But inside him, the real storm was the question that kept blowing through his mind. Why did they come to me? This wasn't instinctive behavior. Wild wolves don't seek help from humans. They avoid. They fight. They flee. But these two creatures, gaunt, frozen, wounded, had come of their own will to his small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. A bold thought suddenly struck him. Matthew stood up and stepped toward the work table, where his old radio and a forest map were kept. He turned the radio on and spun the dials. No signal. The snowstorm had completely jammed the airwaves. He pulled out a topographic map of the northern region and spread it across the table. On it, near the location of his cabin, was a marked area, territory of a wolf pack that had been monitored by wildlife conservationists. A few months ago, he had seen a strange woman placing a recording device near the forest's edge. She had introduced herself as Callista, a researcher from the North Ridge Wildlife Center. Suddenly, everything began to connect. Matthew bent down to inspect the injured hind leg of the smaller wolf. It wasn't just a wound from a fall. He recognized a long, deep gash, like something caused by a steel trap. The cold and the pain had stripped it of its ability to defend itself. And the larger one? It hadn't abandoned its companion. Even exhausted, it had found the way and led them here. They hadn't come by accident. They were seeking someone, not just anyone, but the only person left who could help. Matthew turned back and slowly crouched near the sleeping young wolf. The larger one gave a low growl, but he raised his hand slowly. "I won't hurt it," he whispered. "I just need to understand." And then, something unimaginable happened. The large wolf didn't retreat. It didn't growl again. It just looked at Matthew, long and deep, as if weighing something far beyond instinct. Then it lowered its head, not in submission, but as if giving permission. In that moment, Matthew knew he had been granted a chance that not everyone receives. And in that same moment, he made his choice. Whoever they were, wherever they came from, he had to find Callista. These wolves carried an urgent message. And he, someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding society, was now the final link between survival of the wild and the human. That afternoon, as the last fragile rays of sunlight retreated from the mountainside, a strange sound echoed from behind the cabin. It wasn't the cry of a wild animal, nor the howl of the wind. It was the sound of footsteps, human, light, cautious, as if their owner feared disturbing the delicate balance of this place. Matthew stepped onto the porch, gripping his flashlight tightly and resting an old hunting rifle across his shoulder. Just in case. But before he could say a word, a woman's voice rose from the soft snowfall. "Don't shoot. I'm Callista. I came for them." She stepped out from behind the trees, slender frame, heavy coat dusted with snow, scarf wrapped tightly around her face, revealing only a pair of eyes, vivid blue, awakened against the white forest. Matthew lowered the light, his heart pounding. That name, it was really her. "You're the researcher from North Ridge?" he asked, still unsure if he was dreaming. Callista nodded, pulling down her scarf to reveal a face pale from the cold, but eyes burning with purpose. "Two wolves, one adult male, one adolescent female. They went missing after the storm 3 days ago. I've been tracking blood trails and paw prints for 2 days straight. Then I saw the glow from your cabin." Matthew opened the door without another word. He knew this meeting was a turning point. As Callista entered, the two wolves reacted instantly. The larger one rose, standing guard in front of the smaller, letting out a low growl. But then, in a single moment, all the tension melted away. "Ember," Callista whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "And that's Saul." Matthew glanced at her. "You named them? They're orphaned wolves we've been monitoring since they were pups. Saul has always protected Ember. I was terrified I'd lost them forever." She knelt down, arms open but not reaching, only to show the wolves that she posed no threat. Saul growled softly, then slowly stepped forward. A low sound escaped its throat, not a warning, but something softer, recognition. Callista broke into tears. Inside that small cabin in the middle of a snowstorm, 3 beings, 2 wolves and a woman, found each other in a reunion that by all odds should never have happened. Matthew stood quietly, a warmth rising in his chest that stung like memory. Years of solitude in the wild now felt washed clean by something pure and primal, a connection that crossed species. A bond rooted in something ancient. He never imagined that, after all those years spent avoiding society, it would be the wild itself that brought him back to humanity. And Callista, this woman, Fierce yet gentle, was the bridge between the wilderness and the compassion he once thought he had lost. Callista sat beside Ember, the young wolf limping from her injured hind leg. Eyes dull from pain and exhaustion. Saul, the larger male, remained on his feet like a silent sentinel. His gaze never straying far from either Callista or Matthew. Matthew brought over a blanket and a hot water bottle, placing them gently near Ember. I wrapped the wound as best I could. But her legs swollen and red. Might be infected, he said. Callista nodded, pulling a small leather pouch from her backpack, a compact kit of medical tools designed for wildlife. She carefully unwrapped the old bandage, inspecting the injury closely, then shook her head with quiet dismay. This isn't from a fight, she murmured, her voice dropping. It's long, deep, like a cut from a steel trap. Could be an illegal snare set by poachers. Matthew's jaw clenched, his expression darkening. I found one near the southern creek a few days ago. Dismantled it, but I didn't think. Callista continued disinfecting the wound with practiced hands, her eyes briefly flaring with anger, though her focus never wavered. If that's where this happened, it's no accident. Ember's part of a pack we've been tracking for years. They're cautious. Something must have driven them closer to human territory. Matthew was silent for a while before speaking, his voice slow and heavy. Since the strange snowstorm started, the fish in the lake have been dying, floating pale across the surface. The deer that used to wander near the cabin vanished. I figure the wolves ran out of options. Callista looked up, worry shining clearly in her eyes. The ecosystem is collapsing. Predators like them are being pushed toward people, not to attack, but to survive. Ember whimpered softly as Callista finished dressing the wound with clean bandages and salve. Saul sniffed her once, then lay beside her again, placing his head across her legs like a silent promise of protection. Matthew watched it all unfold, and felt something stir within him. Something he hadn't expected to feel again, the sensation of being trusted. They chose to trust me, he said, his gaze locking with Saul's amber eyes. And I think I'm beginning to trust people again too. Callista turned to him, her expression softening. And we won't leave you behind, she said. We'll protect the vulnerable, human or wolf. But behind her words was something deeper, the beginnings of a bond between souls that had once believed themselves alone in the snow-covered wilderness. And Matthew knew, from that moment on, his journey, once only about survival, had become something else entirely. A journey of return, a quiet rebirth. Snow began falling harder as the sun disappeared behind the mountain ridge. The flakes were large, sharp, like white blades slicing sideways through the spiraling wind. Matthew added more logs to the fireplace. The flickering flames cast wavering shadows across his worried face. In the corner of the room, Saul and Ember lay still, their eyes half closed, half watchful. Callista stepped in through the back door, brushing snow off her heavy coat. She pulled off her gloves and pressed her frozen hands around the cup of hot tea Matthew had just poured. Hard to believe the blizzard's arriving this early, she said. Forecast said it wouldn't hit until tomorrow morning. Matthew glanced out the frosted window. In all my years living here, I've never seen a storm roll in this fast. We'll be snowed in, at least until the day after tomorrow. Callista nodded, then looked toward the wolves. If it weren't for you, they wouldn't have survived the first night. But tonight's different. This storm isn't something they can fight through, especially not like this. Matthew hesitated. If things get worse, we can move them to the basement. I've got a small storage room down there. It's warm enough, and the iron door keeps the wind out. Callista turned to him, eyes lit with quiet trust. I know you're worried, but you're doing the right thing. And they know it. Wind howled through the cabin's eaves like the forest itself was calling. The wooden walls creaked softly, and the firelight danced nervously as if sensing something was shifting. Suddenly, Ember whimpered faintly. Saul lifted his head, ears pricked toward the door. Callista moved quickly, kneeling beside Ember and placing a hand gently on the young wolf's forehead. She's burning up, she whispered. We need to cool her legs and keep her body warm. If her temperature keeps climbing, she might not make it through the night. Matthew rose without a word. I have thin towels, warm water, and another heat pack. Tell me what you need, I'll do it. The two moved in silent rhythm, each step coordinated like an unspoken dance of urgency. Matthew heated water and fetched extra oil lamps. Callista replaced the bandages, cooled Ember's limbs with damp cloths, and checked her breathing over and over. Saul watched in silence, the quiet guardian, placing his trust, for the first time, in human hands. Once everything was in place and the fever had steadied for the moment. Callista sat down beside Ember. Her eyes glistened in the firelight, tears welling up but not falling. Matthew handed her a cup of tea without saying anything. They sat together, a wildlife researcher and a solitary man, bound by the shared burden of caring for two wild creatures once deemed threats to humankind. "You know," Callista whispered, "I used to think that anyone who lived alone out here must have given up on the world." Matthew replied softly, "I didn't give up, I just didn't think the world had a place for me anymore." She looked at him for a long moment. "And now?" He gazed into the fire, where three fragile lives clung to warmth amid a sea of ice. And then he murmured, "Maybe I found my place after all, thanks to the ones the world once called wild." The wind still howled outside. But inside, for the first time in years, Matthew's heart no longer trembled in the storm. A shelter had been formed, not just from timber and stone, but from trust. Early the next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the window fogged with frost. Snow still fell, but it was gentler now, like the fury of the storm had exhausted itself overnight. Matthew carefully opened the front door, one hand clutching his coat, the other gripping a flashlight, and stepped outside to assess the damage around the cabin. The snow had piled up to his knees. In silence, he shoveled a narrow path clear, the rhythmic scrape of metal against snow steady but echoing an unease in his chest. Something felt off. Then he saw it. A trail of footprints, smaller than Ember's, but similar, leading from the forest edge to the side of the cabin. They weren't there when he had come out earlier. These were new. He frowned. No stray wolf would have crossed the storm like that. Unless, just then, a knock at the back door. 3 taps. Even, measured, quiet, but purposeful. Matthew spun around. His boots sank deep into the snow as his heart pounded in his chest. When he opened the back door, a woman appeared, white coat dusted in ice, safety goggles pushed up on her forehead, snow speckled across her cheeks. But her eyes, they were bright, determined. "Are you Matthew?" she asked, her breath curling in the frigid air. "I'm Callista Arvin, from the North Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center. I'm looking for 2 missing wolves, one of them severely injured." Matthew squinted. "You tracked through a blizzard to get here?" She nodded. "I followed blood and hope." Without a word, Matthew stepped aside and opened the door wider. Callista removed her gloves and entered the warm kitchen. As soon as her eyes fell on Ember and Saul, she froze. "Oh my God," she gasped. "It's really them, I thought." She dropped to her knees. Ember let out a soft whimper, but didn't pull away. Saul stood between them, not growling, just watching. Matthew placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They've been here 3 nights. I think they reached their limit." Ember's leg, right side. "I bandaged it the best I could." Saul hasn't left her side. Callista looked up at him, genuine astonishment in her eyes. "You know their names?" He nodded. "I gave them those names. But maybe they were already theirs." She smiled faintly. "Ember is the younger female in the pack. Saul is her brother. They're the only sibling pair I've ever seen who hunt together, even when one is injured. They're the reason I do this work." The fireplace cast flickering light into Callista's eyes as she examined the bandages. "You saved them. You're not a ranger, or a vet, but you did everything right." Matthew chuckled softly. "I just listened." Callista looked up again. "Then I need you to keep listening. Because there's something I must ask." "What is it? Will you let me take them to the center for treatment? To fully heal them, and return them to the wild, if they're strong enough?" Silence. Matthew turned to look at Saul. The wolf's amber gaze seemed to ask the same question. And for the first time, Matthew nodded, not because he wanted to let go, but because he understood. Love doesn't mean holding on. It means returning something to where it truly belongs. A new chapter was beginning. But the old one, where a man and 2 wolves had weathered a storm together, would never be forgotten. That night, Matthew's small cabin became a winter refuge filled with life and quiet hope. Inside, the firelight didn't just warm shivering bodies. It rekindled a long-extinguished faith in a man who had once chosen solitude over the world. Callista sat in the corner of the cabin, carefully rechecking the bandages wrapped around Ember's injured leg. She worked with the precision of a seasoned researcher. But her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. If we'd been a day later, she might have lost the leg, she said softly. Saul, still curled protectively beside his sister, gently rested his head on his front paws. His eyes followed Callista's movements, not with tension anymore, but with the guarded alertness of someone who's known loss too well. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, a warm cup of coffee in hand. His gaze settled on Callista's back, and for a moment, he realized, how long had it been since he'd seen someone observe animals not with fear, but with reverence? The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of firewood and the occasional wail of wind outside the frosted glass. How long were you looking for them? Matthew asked, his voice low but warm. 46 hours straight, Callista replied without looking up. I trekked through snow, slept under pines, lived on protein bars. I knew that if I didn't find them before the storm hit, there'd be nothing left to find. Matthew stared into his cup. Why wolves? He asked. Callista lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Because they're like me. They don't belong to crowds. They're not easy to tame. But once they choose to trust you, they stay loyal until death. A quiet pause settled between them. And in that moment, Matthew understood. They weren't just tending to two wounded wolves. They were mending fractured parts of themselves. As Ember drifted into sleep from exhaustion, Saul lay down beside her, his golden eyes half open, watching both Callista and Matthew, like a sentinel guarding a fragile world straddling wilderness and human tenderness. Callista stretched, fatigue visible in her every movement. We'll need to move them soon. I'll contact the rescue center in the morning. Matthew nodded. I have a snowmobile. Enough room for 3 humans and 2 special passengers. Callista smiled. Special passengers, huh? Seems like they're quite fond of the host. Matthew looked at the wolves resting in the warm circle of firelight. Then said quietly, I think I'm the one they've honored more. That night, they didn't sleep. They took shifts, adding wood to the fire, checking wounds. When dawn neared, Callista finally dozed off in a chair. Matthew covered her with a thick blanket, watching her face relax and sleep. He whispered, You're not the only one the wolves chose. Beside him, Saul breathed calmly, eyes half-lidded, as if silently agreeing, and in that unspoken vow, between man, wolf, and night, a new beginning quietly took root in their hearts. No words needed, just presence, close enough, warm enough. Dawn rose quietly after the snowstorm, a weak light seeping through the frost-covered windowpane. Matthew's cabin was wrapped in a fragile sense of peace, until Saul suddenly shot upright. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood still, ears alert, body tense like a drawn bow ready to snap. Ember remained lying down, but her eyes were open, her head tilting toward the same direction, toward the front door. Matthew, boiling water for the morning, noticed the shift instantly. He set the kettle down, his eyes locking with Saul's alert gaze. Something's not right, he murmured. Callista sat up instantly. Wolves don't raise the alarm without reason. Matthew stepped toward the door, hand resting on the wooden latch. Let me check. But just before he moved further, Saul gave a low growl, not aggressive, but more like a warning. Don't. He stopped. Callista carefully approached the narrow side window and gently pulled back the thick curtain. Outside, unfamiliar footprints stood out against the white snow, larger than a human's. Not a forest animal, not a bear. A shadow flickered at the tree line. A human shape, moving slowly, unnaturally, and making no effort to hide. There's someone out there, Callista whispered. Not a local. I don't recognize the gate. Matthew gripped his flashlight tighter. Could be someone lost in the storm? Or looking for something, Callista replied. And I don't think they're lost. The cabin fell silent. Saul stepped over to Ember, placing himself protectively in front of her, not in a stance to flee, but to fight. Stay here, Matthew told Callista, giving her a slight nod to indicate he'd go outside. I won't go far. But Callista grabbed his arm, her eyes unwavering. We don't know who it is. I'm going with you. Matthew hesitated for a second, then nodded. Together they stepped outside, each footfall sinking into the shallow but biting snow. The wind whispered past their ears. Pine branches swayed overhead like murmuring spirits. As they approached the tree line, the dark figure vanished behind a large trunk. Matthew halted, raising a hand to signal silence. Then suddenly, a woman's voice called out, low, urgent, "Are they in there?" Callista squinted. "Who are you talking about?" From behind the tree, a woman emerged, younger than Matthew had expected. Her face was wrapped in a thick hood and scarf. But her eyes, those couldn't be hidden, tired, sharp, and full of hope. "My name is Talia," she said. "I'm here for the 2 missing wolves. I'm part of the Arctic North Wildlife Rescue Team." Callista took a step forward, hands slightly raised, a gesture known to wolves. No threat. No rush. "I'm Callista. I've been caring for them. But how did you know they were here?" "Tracks." And Talia's voice softened. "I heard their howls. One of them, it was a cry for survival." Matthew glanced at Callista. "Can we trust her?" Callista gave a small nod. Her eyes don't lie. They led Talia back to the cabin. Saul didn't lash out, he stood firm, assessing, but didn't growl. Ember raised her head as Talia knelt down and slowly removed her face covering. Ember trembled, then stretched out her front paw, gently touching Talia's hand, a gesture full of recognition. "My baby," Talia whispered. Callista looked at Matthew, her voice hushed. "We're not alone in this." Matthew said nothing, but his hand curled into a fist, not out of fear, but because something far greater was approaching, and he was ready to stand between it and the 2 creatures that had shaken his soul awake. And just like that, a new chapter began, no longer just between man and wolf, but between the guardians, who had found one another at the edge of the world, the heart of the wild. The humble wooden cabin had once again become the center of an unexpected gathering, not just among 3 wolves, but among people who were never meant to cross paths. Matthew poured more hot water into the kettle, his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of unspoken things. Callista sat close to Ember, replacing the bandages under the dim light. Talia sat across from them, her eyes fixed on Saul, as if trying to decipher what was going through the mind of that silent guardian. "They got separated from the pack during a storm," Talia said softly. "We tracked them for 3 days. And then the trail vanished." "You knew them before?" Matthew asked, eyes never leaving the handle of his cup. "Yes. I've been monitoring the northern snowpack wolves for the past 4 years. Saul and Ember are twins. But Ember was always weaker, more fragile. The last time I saw them was on a trail camera near the gorge. And then, they disappeared." Callista looked over. "They came here. We don't know why, but they chose to trust." Talia smiled faintly, something very human glowing in her eyes. "Wolves always know the way home, even if it's not the old path." Matthew leaned back in his chair, realizing something clearly. He was no longer alone. He had stepped into something much larger than himself, where nature, humanity, and instinct wove into one another like snow-laden branches of the forest. A while later, Talia opened her pack and took out a small device, a wildlife tracking chip. "I'd like to reattach a tracker to Ember, if you both agree, to keep track." Without disturbing her, Saul stepped forward. He didn't growl. He didn't block the way. He simply watched, then turned and slowly walked over to Ember. Matthew understood, that was permission. Talia nodded, exhaling. "I've never seen a pair as resilient as this." Callista whispered, "Not just resilient, they know how to love." As night fell again, the 3 of them sat around the fire. They didn't speak much, but the silences no longer felt heavy. They were comforting. Matthew spoke aloud, almost to himself. "I think I know why they came here. Not because of me, but because there was no one else." Talia smiled. "But now there is." Callista tilted her head toward the 2 wolves curled up together, body to body. "Them being here is a miracle. And maybe miracles only happen when humans dare to open the door." Matthew gripped his cup of tea a little tighter. "For the first time in my life, I don't see this cabin as a cage." Talia looked at him, her gaze carrying something deeper than gratitude. "Maybe, because you were never truly alone." Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside the cabin, among wounded souls, a silent pact had been forged. One man, 2 conservationists, 3 wolf spirits, and 1 chance to change how the world sees the wild. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, they would continue forward, together. No longer alone. The next morning, the sun rose quietly over the tree line, like a sign of nature's agreement. Its light shimmered across the thick blanket of snow, illuminating 3 silhouettes preparing for the most important journey since the unlikely gathering had begun. Matthew silently checked the bindings on the sled hitched to the back of the snowmobile, a crude vehicle, yet carefully lined with blankets, animal pelts, and dried pine leaves to keep the 3 wolves warm. Ember, though still weak, could now rest her head on Saul, and the third wolf, the one they had named Shade, remained vigilant. Yet his gaze had softened whenever he saw Callista or Talia. "Are you sure it will be safe there?" Matthew asked Talia as he helped load the final supply crate. "We have a dedicated recovery area for injured wildlife," she replied. "No metal cages, just low wooden fencing, surrounded by forest, and a team of specialists. But they'll only stay until their wounds are healed. Then they'll be released." Together, Callista stepped forward, gently placing her hand on Ember's shoulder in a quiet farewell. Ember didn't pull away. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, as if sensing a promise that needed no words. They departed. The sled glided through the snowy forest, speeding across trails Matthew knew by heart. But this time, he wasn't the solitary man out gathering wood, he was a guide. For life, for hope. Throughout the journey, wind whispered through the treetops. But within the sled, the 3 wolves lay side by side, their breathing steady and calm. No howling, no fear, just 3 beings who seemed to understand. They were no longer abandoned. When they reached the rendezvous point, a research team was already waiting. The rescue station stood built from pine wood, surrounded by low wooden fencing, bathed in tree shadows, no artificial sounds, only the stillness of the deep forest. Just as these creatures had always known. Shade was the first to step off. Then Saul. And finally Ember, slowly but steadily. Her legs supported by carefully rue-wrapped bandages courtesy of Callista. As all 3 entered the recovery zone, they didn't glance around nervously like captured animals. They walked straight into the light-dappled grove inside that enclosed woodland, as if they knew they were home. Matthew stood still, his gaze fixed on the shadows gradually vanishing behind the low trees. "You okay?" Callista asked, her voice warm and steady. Matthew nodded slightly. I wasn't just saying goodbye to 3 wolves. You were also letting go of an old part of your solitude." Talia added. Silence fell. Each of them was quietly processing a transformation within. Where exactly was the boundary between human and wild, when what truly connected them was empathy? Before leaving the station, Matthew turned back one last time to look toward the woods. From afar, Saul was standing there, watching. No howl, no steps forward, just watching, as if to say, "We remember." Then he turned and disappeared into the forest. One chapter had closed. Another, about healing, about trust between humanity and nature, had just begun. But a quiet question still lingered in Matthew's heart. Was this the end of their connection? Or merely the beginning of another miracle? Days passed since Matthew had sent the 3 wolves to the rehabilitation center. The small cabin on the forest's edge returned to its familiar stillness, only the wind, the crackling of firewood, and the soft breath of a man who had begun to see life with different eyes. He still rose early, chopped wood, boiled water, and tended to his modest greenhouse as always. But subtle new habits had taken root, setting aside an extra portion of meat, placing an extra bowl of water on the porch, and each morning, standing quietly for a long time, staring at the snow-covered trail, the very path where 3 shadows once emerged like ghosts from a snow dream. Callista kept in touch. She sent photos, health updates, and short video clips. Ember was out of her bandages, her leg fully healed. Saul remained ever by her side, while Shade, the last wolf they had rescued, had begun to howl again under the full moon. "They're recovering well," she wrote, "but I think they still remember you." One early spring afternoon, the snow began to melt along the mountain slopes. The sun hung low, casting soft golden light over the ancient pines. Matthew received a call from Callista. "They're ready," she said. "Next week, we'll be releasing them back into their original territory. The tracker shows the rest of their pack just returned after migration. Matthew didn't respond right away. He stood quietly for a long time by the window, gazing into the deep forest. "Would you like to come?" Callista asked gently. He nodded, not to hold them back, but to say goodbye, as a friend. On the day of their release, not a single cloud marked the sky. It was as if the forest held its breath to listen. Matthew stood beside Callista at the forest's edge. The wooden enclosure's gate opened. Shade stepped out first, then Ember, steady, strong, and finally Saul, walking last, his gaze scanning the world again with the eyes of one who had known pain, who had learned to love, and who had been forgiven. Not one of them ran. No howls, no hesitation. They simply walked, with purpose, with calm, as if returning home. But at the forest's final boundary, Saul paused. He turned his head. Matthew stood there. He didn't speak. He didn't move forward. He simply smiled, and placed his hand gently over his heart. Saul lifted his head, and let out a deep, resonant howl. It wasn't sad. It wasn't desperate. It was a farewell. A promise. A thank you. Then all three disappeared into the woods, like snow spirits that perhaps never existed, yet left their tracks etched forever in the heart of one man. Months later, as summer approached, Callista returned to the cabin. Matthew sat on the porch, reading the same old book he had once turned page by page in solitude. Ember left a signal near the western hill yesterday, Callista said, placing a bag of coffee down beside him. Matthew smiled. I take it they're still together? Always three. Always a pack. Callista handed him a photo. 3 wolves standing atop a hill, looking straight into the camera. But in their eyes was the reflection of firelight, of a home, of someone who once opened his arms in a silent winter. Matthew stared at the photo for a long moment, then slipped it inside his old book. There, between pages yellowed with time, a new story had been written. Not one that needed to be told aloud, because some sacred things are meant to be remembered quietly, forever, in the heart. Dear friend, not all of us have saved a wolf. Not all of us live in a cabin nestled deep in a snow-covered forest. But perhaps, each of us has, at some point, opened the door of our heart to something wild, a wound, a memory, or a lost soul searching for warmth. The story of Matthew, of Callista, and the 3 wolves, it's not just a tale of survival. It's a symphony between trust and instinct, between fear and compassion. One outstretched hand, one silent night, can change everything. Can gift you the quiet knowing that you are not alone in this world. If you've ever wondered whether kindness can truly create miracles, remember that dawn, when 3 wild silhouettes turned back at the edge of the forest and man. Live as if every creature you meet, even just once, might carry a piece of your soul with them. Forever. And if you ever need a reason to keep believing in gentleness, let this story whisper to you on winter nights. Some creatures may never say thank you, but they will forever remember the one who lit a fire in the cold. Wishing you a day as peaceful as the first snowfall. Until we meet again in the next story, where souls that once seemed so far apart might touch with just a glance.